Welcome to Current Affairs. My name is Nathan Robinson. I am the editor-in-chief of Current Affairs magazine. Today, Grace Blakeley returns to the program. Her bio on her new book, Vulture Capitalism, Corporate Crimes, Backdoor Bailouts, and the Death of Freedom, describes her, I think, accurately as one of the fiercest anti-capitalist advocates of her generation. I like fierce. Not just smart, but fierce.
I would really like for you to introduce me wherever I go.
I'm a
just
hype
whatever
man.
you just said. I want that recorded. I want that played before I go out anywhere. Just to like hype me up, get me in the mood.
This is what I do. I'm the hype man for the guests, because I gotta convince people that you want to listen to the guest. So I want to.
Well, it worked. I'm hyped. I'm so hyped.
I describe you to people, Grace Blakeley, as scary smart. And because you know everything about the global economy, you've read everything. This new book, Vulture Capitalism, contains mountains of research. It explains the way the entire global economy works, and it also provides a compelling alternate vision of how the entire economy could be structured. That's what you'll get when you pick up Vulture Capitalism by Grace Blakeley. Grace Blakeley, welcome to Current Affairs.
Thank you so much for having me. What an intro. What a description of the book. I'm so glad that you enjoyed it.
Yeah, it's phenomenal. I really do mean that. And so okay. There's so much in the book, though. So I was trying to think, what can I start with that is simple, that is at the core of this? And I think one thing that is at the core of it that is quite simple is that we have this popular conception that is everywhere, there's something called the state, and there's something called the market. And capitalism is when the market makes decisions and people choose what to buy in the market, and that's what determines what happens in the economy. And the state is this other thing, and socialism is when the state does planning. The state there's central plan. The state owns everything. They do the planning. And this conception, this bipolar conception, this binary state, market, capitalism, central planning is very, very common. And I think one of the core things you're trying to do is blow this apart.
Yeah, just completely blow it up. It's just wrong. And I think, the reason that I started thinking that this was something that I needed to write was it was at the beginning of the pandemic, actually, when in 2019, there had been the recent loss of the general election by the Labour Party. The Conservative won again. And I was doing a bunch of interviews in the pandemic on TV, and all the kind of newsreaders and the interviewers were saying, but, Jeremy Corbyn lost the election, but ultimately you got what you wanted because we have the state spending loads of money, and that's socialism, right? So, we didn't even need Jeremy Corbyn to win the election because you've got socialism. It's being delivered by this Conservative Party. And I just found it so staggering every time I was confronted with this argument. It led me to realize that the vast majority of people, even like educated people who are like asking you these questions, just don't know the difference between capitalism and socialism and have this flawed understanding of what capitalism actually is. And it comes from, I go into this in the book, it comes from this divide that we've had in our politics between like social democracy and neoliberalism, between like Hayek, who is the darling of the neoliberals, and Keynes.
That's Friedrich von.
Yes, Friedrich von Hayek, yeah, and J.M. Keynes, who were the kind of, two heroes or villains, depending on which side you're on, of our economic and political debate for most of the 20th century, really. So you had Keynes saying, we need a state to tame the irrationalities of the market. We need government intervention. We need the public sector to invest. And even if, in the middle of a crisis, there's nothing to invest in, we should just pay people to dig holes, just to give them jobs, to create incomes and kind of boost, economic growth. And then there's Hayek, who comes in and says, this kind of planning by the state is the source of all tyranny. It creates inefficiencies. It undermines the functioning of the market. And we need less state. We need kind of, a different kind of state, really. One that does less stuff, basically. And that kind of argument that won in the 1980s, right? So you saw neoliberals like Thatcher and Reagan, Pinochet in Chile come to power everywhere. And they set about basically, we're told that they shrink the state, but they don't shrink the state.
Yes. Even leftists say this.
Yeah, exactly. We get caught out here because, we've also signed up to this kind of dichotomy. So we often, say things like they deregulated and they, reduced public spending and all that sort of stuff. And while some cases it's true, it's very misleading because the type of regulation that we have, there wasn't less regulation after the neoliberal shift. There was actually often more because it required a huge amount of regulation to create markets where no markets existed before, like, for example, in healthcare, in areas of the public sector. And at the same time, we didn't see a fall in public spending. We haven't seen that over the last kind of several decades. We've seen massive increases in subsidies for the rich, tax cuts that benefit for the rich. We've seen bank bailouts. We've seen, pandemic bailouts that have channeled billions of dollars of public funds into the hands of private corporations. So what's happened isn't that the state has become smaller and there's more space for the market. So that means more socialism and less capitalism. What's actually shifted from the social democratic era, the post-war era, to the neoliberal era, from like the, 40s, 50s, 60s to the 80s, 90s, noughties, and up to today, is the nature of state policy and whose interests it serves. There's been a shift in the balance of class power such that the state is now used by capital, by the wealthy, by elites to serve their own interests.
Okay, I want to break this down because, as I say, I really do feel like this idea that there is this spectrum between how much the government produces the economy and how much the market makes economic decisions. That idea is so ingrained. And as you pointed out, you brought up the economists Hayek and Keynes in the 20th century, where Hayek is writing this book, The Road to Serfdom, where he says, if the welfare programs and healthcare and all that, soon you'll have Nazism in Britain or whatever it is. It's kind of it's incredible that this argument was taken so seriously because it's insane. But then you have, as you say, on the opposite pole, you have Keynes, this idea that in fact the economy is going to be a disaster unless there are decisions made in government about how to allocate resources. Okay, you say that's not the way to think of that. That's not the spectrum of possible ideas. Break us out a little bit of the spectrum. Give us, I don't know, is there a third person? Is there a third economist that we can bring in here that might have some other ideas?
There's Karl Marx. Now, I look at a lot of what, I come from a Marxist perspective, basically. And so what that means when you're thinking about how to analyze capitalism or to really analyze a society in general is that you don't end, but you start by looking at the way that society produces things. So, feudalism, that was a system of aristocrats and peasants, and land was a very important asset that was used to produce, basic agricultural commodities. And the way that their political system worked was that there were lords who owned the land and peasants who worked the land. And so the whole nature of that social system was organized around land and how that was governed, and the political system kind of flowed from that. Moving into capitalism, this is a system oriented around the production of commodities and, the production of commodities within corporations, in which there is a divide between the people who own everything we need to produce commodities and those who are forced to sell their labor power for a living. So, you have this insight from the very beginning. Capitalism is a class-based system where there's a clear social division of labor between the people who own all the stuff and the people who have to work for a living. So the thing that really, the kind of most that shapes how capitalist societies work is the balance of class power in that society. It's not the balance between the market and the corporate and the state. Sorry, those things, are kind of important in determining, how certain actors can make their voices known. So, for example, during the post-war period, when there was a larger state, it was easier for the labor movement to organize within the state to make certain demands that were ultimately realized. But that power that they held within the state didn't come because the state was bigger. It came because they were organized enough to have built up these powerful institutions that were capable of organizing both within the state and within corporations as well. So the whole of society, you had, higher wages and more public services and all those different sorts of things. Basically, that society was structured in such a way that it operated more in the interests of workers than the society that we have today. Now, the neoliberal assault wasn't about shrinking the state. And again, this was a powerful narrative, and it seized on the kind of liberatory narratives that had been put forward around 1968 around personal freedom and autonomy. The idea that there was this crushing, repressive state apparatus that was like keeping everyone under its control, which of course was, in a way kind of true. The neoliberals seized upon that and said, we are going to shrink the state and create space for personal freedom within the market. And there'll be lots of small producers all creating all the things that you need. There'll be entrepreneurship. You'll be able to kind of, work on these amazing ideas and bring those ideas to market. And you'll be able to invest however you want in stock markets, etc. So it was all really oriented around the idea of personal freedom. Now, that was very deceptive and very powerful, because what we ended up with was not an economy that kind of prioritized personal freedom. It was an economy dominated not by small individual producers and small investors that were operating in the market, but these massive corporate behemoths, these massive financial institutions that have insane amounts of power and that are also increasingly operating within the state in the same way that organized labor once did to get their demands met. And again, that comes down to not necessarily the size of the state or the size of the market or whatever. It's about the balance of class power. And there are lots of reasons that we could go into as to why that shifted so much. But it was partly because of this, outright battle that was being fought on a both kind of ideological and material level that the neoliberals ultimately won. That ultimately, capital basically got its way. And there's some examples of this that I lay out in the book that I think might be helpful in just explaining what this means. So like listeners might remember the Boeing, the MAX disasters.
Yeah, you talk a lot about Boeing.
Yeah. So that, obviously happened a couple of years ago. It's now in the news again because there's more kind of engineering failure.
Right. Just come back in time for the publication of the book.
I know. It's very convenient. And yeah, basically, readers can read the story of Boeing in the book. So I won't go into it in too much detail, but suffice to say, the corporate culture became, just unbelievably financialized. The whole purpose of corporations shifted from kind of, producing planes to just maximizing value for shareholders.
You could produce planes or money.
Yeah, literally. So, there was like this whole new cast of managers that was created to kind of cut costs and extract value from the firm. Unions were attacked. Even engineers actually were attacked. The whole idea was just like, make these planes as cheaply and as quickly as possible. And it emerged later that after the disasters that Boeing had actually, the senior management of Boeing had known there are these massive flaws in this airplane that led it to potentially like nosedive out of the sky, and they did nothing about it. The FAA did nothing about it because they had effectively become captured by the very institutions they were supposed to be regulating. And the state, of course, which is supposed to be this counterweight to what's going on in the market, actually aided and abetted Boeing. They were channeling billions of dollars worth of corporate welfare into the company at the same time. So, this idea that we have like states and markets fighting each other for influence is just completely and utterly false. Most of the time, public and private interests are working not just alongside each other, but through each other. Like private corporations work through the state. The state often works through private corporations. So we just need to like take this idea of this big separation between state and market and just throw it onto the dustbin of history.
Well, as you mentioned, even socialists kind of fall into this. There was this famous, economic debate, the socialist calculation debate is often called, about whether you could have a functional, as I understand it, whether an economy could function without prices and markets, as if that's a debate over socialism. And whereas that's kind of a separate debate, the debate over whether central planning can work without prices and markets is often seen as a kind of debate about socialism, because socialism was associated with central planning and a lack of markets and prices. But as you point out in the book, under the system that we call capitalism, there is tons of central planning without markets and prices in these giant entities called corporations.
Yeah. So corporate, this is kind of where I start the book, really. It's by saying, okay, so Hayek says an economy is far too complex to be centrally planned. There's all of this stuff that, there's so many variables, so many kind of feedback loops, so many different actors interacting with one another. It would be impossible for one institution to take control of this whole thing and tell everyone what to do. Would you say, right, fair enough, because, from history, that seems to be the case. But if we look at the way that capitalism actually works, that is how it works. It's a small number of very powerful people basically making decisions on behalf of everyone else. So, we can talk about the corporation and that. I look at how corporations plan, how financial institutions plan, how states plan, and how empires plan. Now, the state side of things is kind of more accepted. It's more accepted that states can plan. I actually look at how state power functions and show that it tends to basically favor the interests of capital. But even within the corporation, you have this immense amount of power concentrated in decision makers at the top of the corporation, precisely because these corporations do not really operate in a market. So within the corporation, we know the way decisions are made is based on authority. Managers, senior managers, they decide how the firm is going to operate, and then everyone else simply has to follow.
You got to do what you're told if you're at the bottom.
Exactly. But the idea is supposed to be that those decisions are dictated by the market. So, the market says produce X amount of Y commodity, and managers consult that, and then they make a decision, and maybe they get it a bit wrong, so they adjust it, and that's all reflected in profits. But that feedback mechanism doesn't work at all when you have consolidated corporate power, which we do, across the whole economy, particularly in the US, but also to an increasing extent in Europe, where, a lot of, particularly the most significant kind of productive sectors, are just characterized by these massive international monopolies that do have some competition in the sense that there's, a few other firms, but generally those firms collude with one another. They don't really compete over price. And more than that, they have the power to kind of operate within and through state institutions to make sure that they get their way regardless. So, you don't see Schumpeter, who was another theorist of capitalism, had this idea of creative destruction. And this was what kept the kind of entrepreneurial spirit alive. It's that if you didn't compete and come up with amazing new ideas, then you would die. But that isn't the case anymore. These firms survive no matter what. Even Boeing, right? It's gone through all of these incredibly horrendous disasters. It's basically killed tons of people. And it still exists. And it's probably never going to not exist because the American state won't allow it to collapse.
Well, yes. So help us understand a little more detail what that means for a company not to be subject to market discipline. Is it that, Boeing can fuck up a million times and there's not going to be change in what the market does because is there going to be another plane manufacturer is just going to spring up in the United States?
It's a lot of different factors. So firstly, the argument that Marx made as to why what he called centralization would increase over time under capitalism is that production just becomes a lot more complex. So you need a lot more stuff to start a business in something like aerospace. Like you need an immense amount of capital to be able to buy. It's so complicated. It's so complex. You need a lot of capital. You need a huge amount of expertise. You need a lot of connections and, contracts basically with other large corporations. So basically, it's kind of impossible to really start an aerospace company on the scale of something like Boeing from the ground up. You have 2 or 3 established firms in that sector. At the moment, we've got Airbus and Boeing, and they just exist. They have all the capital, they have all the knowledge, they have all the expertise. The barriers to entry are just huge. And that's just a function of the nature of capitalist development. But a second and arguably more important factor, and something that's overlooked by a lot of kind of pure economists, is that you inevitably, when you get these big corporate behemoths, they have very close links with states, and particularly with the state in which they're headquartered. So, Boeing has really, really deep links with the American state, with the Department of Defense, with various different administrations, and it, can lobby for tax cuts. It has a huge influence over state governments, let alone federal governments, because often it's a massive employer. So it's able to just, influence it. We've seen it was able to influence regulation, lobby, and kind of basically extract value out of the American state at all levels. And it's actually the same with Airbus in the EU. There's been all sorts of kind of scandals surrounding Airbus and throughout the aerospace industry, lots of issues around kind of corruption and fraud and those sorts of things, precisely because these relationships between senior executives and members of the state, a particular state or international institutions or whatever, are so important to ensuring the survival of this firm, which is something that investors pay attention to. So when there's a scandal, nobody seriously thinks that Boeing's going to collapse because the American state isn't going to allow it to collapse. So the capital doesn't flee. The money just keeps flooding in. And we've seen this, Boeing's share price, wasn't until recently, wasn't dramatically affected by the events that took place several years ago with the Max disasters. And, we saw like it got tons of support from the state over the course of the pandemic. So, yeah, it's just that markets don't operate the way that they are theorized to operate according to your average mainstream economist. And basically, this comes down to the fact that our worldview kind of is based on this idea that there's this big separation between politics and economics. So there's like economics, which is numbers and companies and finance, whatever. And then there's politics, which is like messy arguments and like, not numbers. And these two worlds are kind of incompatible. But actually, they are part of one system, which is capitalism. And, the relationships between allegedly separate institutions within a capitalist economy have massive implications for the way that system works.
You're listening to the Current Affairs podcast from Current Affairs magazine in New Orleans, Louisiana. Current Affairs is a registered 501c3 nonprofit organization, and we depend entirely on reader subscriptions and donations. You'll notice we have no ads, no mattresses, no recruiters, no sports betting. If you can help us in our mission to build independent progressive media, please visit currentaffairs.org/donate to make a donation, or currentaffairs.org/subscribe to subscribe to our beautiful print magazine. Thank you so much for supporting our work. Now, back to the program.
Now, I want to put to you, what do you say when you meet someone who describes themselves as a free market libertarian? You lay out what you've just laid out for me, and they reply to you and say, well, what you're describing, that's not capitalism, that's crony capitalism. This is a libertarian buzzword term. And they say, of course, I don't believe that the state should be doing special favors for corporations. I believe that we should have a free market. The things you're describing, they're very bad, but they're not real, pure capitalism.
Those people have no theory of the state. They have no working or functional or even comprehensible theory of power, really. Because, the state isn't just a thing that exists out there that, you get into government, you pick it up and you do things with it. It is a very complex set of institutions that exists, outside of just what we would usually refer to as kind of the institutions of government. So governments can change, but the wider state apparatus in a lot of ways remains the same. And the way that those institutions function reflects the balance of power in society as a whole. Now, that sounds complicated, but it's actually very simple. The companies and individuals, often institutions, that are able to wield power within state institutions or over particular politicians are the ones that are able to get their way. They have those policies that they want to see enacted. And, it kind of goes back to what I was talking to before, like back in the post-war period, there was a more equal balance of power in both the US and the UK and most of the developed world between corporations and workers. Workers had their institutions that would lobby within the state for their interests, and private corporations had their institutions that would lobby within the state for their interests. What happened after the 1980s was that the workers basically were crushed. And so the scales began to tilt just extremely unevenly in favor of capital, basically. And so what you see, in the book, I use the example, right, of the fossil fuel companies, right? You get a president like Biden who is elected, and a big part of his platform is saying, I'm going to cut emissions, I'm going to really do something about climate breakdown. And even assuming that he was even vaguely sincere about wanting to do something about that, which I know is debatable, like what ultimately ends up happening is that he puts through a number, some legislation that is designed to curb climate breakdown, at the same time as different parts of the state continue to, say, expand offshore drilling or provide massive subsidies to fossil fuel companies. And you see what looks like on the surface, these really contradictory set of policies. Like the American state on the one hand is saying, we're going to help decarbonize. On the other hand, it's giving loads of money to fossil fuel companies. And you're like, what's going on? But actually, when you understand the state not as a kind of coherent entity that does things as an individual, but as this complex set of different institutions, all of which are influenced by social relations, by lobbyists, by, corporations, it becomes more comprehensible because many of these powerful institutions are able to get their way, often through the back door.
So it's a fantasy, this idea that you could still have the giant, powerful corporations, but somehow with no influence over state policy.
are they imagining when they think of
Right.
the state? I think they are imagining this idea of like a nice institution that's very simple, that just, everyone in the institution does exactly as they're told by the people at the top. And it's like, no organization works that way. All organizations are complicated. They rely on these kind of like, difficult institutional hierarchies and, weird ways of getting things done. Anyone who's worked in an organization knows that. So the idea that the state is just this neutral tool that you can just kind of pick up and get to do stuff is just absurd.
Now, let me put one more kind of counter argument to you, or something someone might say in response to you, where they might say, well, yes, there are giant entrenched corporations. For example, in the United States, we have the major car companies. We have Ford and GM. But look, in recent years, the market has worked its magic because an upstart competitor, Tesla, under Elon Musk, disrupted the industry. And the car industry was precisely the sort of industry that nobody would have thought that could be done in, because of those very barriers to entry you described. It's extremely, extremely costly and difficult to open a new car factory. But it was done, which shows that the power of creative destruction under capitalism is not dead yet, as you say it is. Grace Blakeley, how do you reply to that?
Well, it's an interesting question. And I think it requires us to look at the development of the auto sector in the US over a slightly longer period of time. Because, the auto manufacturers are just, again, these massive corporations that are also, they have a significant amount of market power. And that is something that, Ford was kind of one of the original monopolies, really. And like, I look in the book at the example of the Ford Motor Company, how the Ford family really tried to just like dominate and control their workers, and succeeded in doing that from the very inception of the company. Obviously, that begins to change as you start seeing much more competition from abroad. And so the only way that most of the auto manufacturers, particularly Ford, actually managed to survive is through getting most of their profits not from selling cars, but from basically becoming little mini banks. So the Ford Motor Credit Company became substantially more profitable than the actual car manufacturing side of Ford in the run-up to the financial crisis. Of course, that required it to take on loads of debt. Of course, that eventually meant that it became kind of financially unstable. And of course, that meant that it went to the government for a bailout through the back door. So Ford survived, got a bailout. It's not often included in the companies that are listed as having received bailouts, but it got money through this loan scheme provided by a different government department, not through TARP. Then obviously the other car manufacturers did get tons of money through TARP. So the entire US automobile sector is saved through a massive bailout from the state. It's not particularly healthy. It's not particularly competitive, but it continues to exist despite market forces saying that it likely shouldn't exist. Then, of course, you do get this kind of like upstart company that is allegedly going to kind of revolutionize the production of cars in the US, and does to an extent kind of begin to like compete with those entrenched giants. But again, with support from the state. Like all of these companies rely on support that has been put in place by the state, whether that's tax incentive, R&D incentives, all these different sorts of things. And ultimately, we have a market, an auto market in the US that does look pretty irrational and has looked pretty irrational for a while now, but basically limps on because of the massive support that is, continued to be provided by the US state. Now, I'm not saying that is necessarily, the worst thing in the world, because there are obviously lots of workers in those sectors. If they didn't have jobs, would just kind of be out on the streets because there's no functioning kind of plan to transition the US economy away from sectors like auto manufacturing. But it is also just demonstrates the mythology of this idea that capitalism is a free market system. The US is like the center of global capitalism, and there are huge swathes of that economy that are basically entirely dependent or like significantly dependent upon both market power, so corporate power over the market, and also the relationship between corporations and the state.
Yeah, it strikes me that one major takeaway of your book is that simple fables about the economy just overlook how incredibly complicated the world is, and that you can't, if you start to conceive of it in lemonade stand terms, you're not really going to understand how the world works. Just to conclude here, in terms of where we can start in our better conception of how the world works, it does strike me that one of the things that you draw our attention to over and over is, instead of thinking I mean, we should think a lot about the questions of planning and prices and markets and institutions and how they work. But one thing we should really zero in on if we want to understand what kind of economy we live in is that question of power. Who has it? Who doesn't? And if you want a socialist system, don't look at what the size of the state is. Begin with the question, who is in control of what? Where are our decisions made? And how are they made? So tell us a little bit more about how we can begin with an analysis of power to illuminate a lot of things about the world.
Yeah, exactly. And I mean, you said it was complicated, and it is complicated, but in some ways it is kind of simple. It's like, who gets to make the rules? Who gets to determine who gets what? And at the moment, that is basically just corporate executives, politicians that are in the pockets of corporate executives, unelected technocrats at, high levels of the state. And that kind of system of like capitalist oligarchy, which is basically what we have. We have this fusion of public and private power, like a small number of very influential people at the top who get to decide how the whole system runs. And the opposite to that isn't a bigger state, because then you just get a kind of different constellation of interests that are basically making decisions that serve to reinforce the status quo and continue to give power and wealth to those at the top. Or indeed, more market, because again, you get the same sort of thing. The question is, how do we create a real democracy? How do we make sure that the decisions that are being made about people's lives aren't being taken by corporate executives or technocrats or politicians, but are actually, to the extent that it's possible, being taken by them? And so that really requires a thorough democratization of the economy. It requires a thorough democratization of society. So yes, it means things like having collective ownership of the most important resources in our society. So, workers should own the firms that they work in. People say, oh, that's impossible, it wouldn't work. Well, I highlight in the book a lot of times throughout history where it has worked and where workers have actually come together and shown that they have the expertise to be able to govern the firms in which they work, and actually often to do so better than the managers that came before them in the sense of running the firm more efficiently and more effectively. So, that requires, as I said, a kind of shift in ownership. But it also requires a real transformation in how we think about decision making. So like, if you take politics, for example, the idea that we're just going to, change the way that the political system works by voting for a different set of politicians, all of whom are basically still in the pockets of like big businesses, of financial institutions, and who are going to go into a state that is already substantially weighted in favor of the interests of one class. It's just kind of crazy to think we could just change everything just by voting. So what is really required is to think about how we organize in our workplaces, in our communities, on the streets, to try and create a kind of counter power from below that is capable of resisting the power that is exercised over people, whether that's in the state, whether it's in, corporations, wherever, and to start to build some alternatives. And the alternatives, I think, are the most exciting part of this, because I think the big challenge that the left faces isn't that people don't think the system doesn't work. Everyone knows the system doesn't work, right? Like, the challenge is that people can't imagine a different world. And I think the reason they can't imagine a different world is because we're so focused on individualism. It's always like, what can I do? How can I change the world? And it's like, you alone cannot go up against all these forces that are immensely powerful. But you, as part of a collective, can start to shift things. And in the book, there are all these examples that I look at of like literally just communities who have come together and said, we're going to do things differently, and created like massive change in their local area.
Yeah, you go from London to India to Australia to Chile, and you look at and you explain various experiments and how they have worked. And so I think that is one of the best parts of the book, is part 3, where, because it's possible to read this and think, well, okay, so I am up against massive institutions that I can't possibly fight. You show that that is not, in fact, true, and that's inspiring, and I think that people will come away from the book feeling a sense of determination.
I hope so, if they manage to make it to the end.
Yeah, I do encourage everyone who picks it up to stay through part 3 if you feel yourself losing hope.
Yeah, or just skip ahead to part 3. You can start with part 3 if you want.
Nothing stops you from reading part 3 before you read parts 1 and 2.
Exactly.
So pick up Vulture Capitalism, Corporate Crimes, Backdoor Bailouts, and the Death of Freedom. Grace Blakeley, thank you so much for returning on Current Affairs.
Thank you so much for having me, Nathan.
The Current Affairs Podcast is a product of Current Affairs Magazine. If you are not subscribed to Current Affairs Magazine, visit currentaffairs.org/subscribe today and get our glorious print edition. The Current Affairs Podcast is released regularly every week on patreon.com/currentaffairs. Thanks for listening.